Y'all, test run was finally out. Wizard101 just updated a bunch of spells. There are tons of things to talk about. Not only did they add new spellman paths for spells that are ranked 7 to 10 for every single school, they even changed some spells for schools from other sources. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the fire, ice, and storm changes. I have to split it up because there's so much to talk about. But what I will say before we jump right into every spell change is that this update is looking kind of magnificent. I think they learned from the last time that they made a spellman update like this. Any level can now farm for this according to the update note, which means unlike our experience with the previous gigantic spellman update where they added spellman paths for rank 1 through 6, there should be a lot more options for spells with a lot less hassle. So the first ice spell that we're going to be talking about is Frost Giant. Now I did cover this in a previous video because this is one of the ones that they teased, but it is looking really good. It's a blade counter that affects up to 5 blades and can create up to 5 traps. What's really cool about this spellman update is that even if a spell is an AoE, if you single target with it, it acts like the damage of a single target spell. So you could use this in 1v1, or if you're, soloing as you go through the world, you could use this and get the full 7 pips of value even when you're single targeting someone, which is a big change from what we're used to with AoEs. But yes, very good blade counter, much better than Wyvern for ice right now. The traps are probably going to be menacing, but there's a reason I started on the ice, and it's not because of Frost Giant. And I'm gonna keep it a stack with you. I don't think it's really because of Snow Angel either. This is also kind of a mid spell for ice. So what this spell does is it gambits traps that you've already cast on your opponent. It gives up something that's already helping you, which is why I don't think it's that good. But let's say that someone were to blade 70 times and you got 5 traps out of it, you can now immediately turn those traps into weaknesses on your opponent while doing damage. That's essentially what this does. At max tier, it does 755 damage, and it basically transfers up to 4 traps into 4 weaknesses. It could be really good. It is super situational. I think it could be extremely good against blade stackers because they're gonna blade, you can turn those into traps, and then you can debuff them with those traps. Now here is where it gets absolutely ridiculous. Ice is officially one of 2 schools now, and it's never been like this, that can hit literally through weaknesses. This is a really big deal. Up to this point, the only spell that could literally ignore weaknesses was Stone Colossus, which is a mid spell. But now what Ice King R does, it clears up to 5 weaknesses for you. You might be seeing a pattern here. Now the pips are like at 8, the effects are affecting a lot of stuff. 5 weaknesses is quite a bit. How often do you even have 5 weaknesses on you? But it's absolutely nuts. It clears weaknesses, turns them into 70 shields based on the school of your opponent. That's what this means. And then it hits. Now the damage, not amazing, obviously, 535, but keep in mind, not only are you hitting through weaknesses, you're also defending yourself at the same time with a set shield based on your opponent's school. A very common tactic is for Death Wizards just to spam 3-folds at you in PvP. A lot of people don't even PvP because of this strategy. It's very annoying. But if someone were to 3-fold you twice, right, as in effectively put 6 weaknesses on you, what this spell would do is it would get rid of 5 of them, give you 5 70% death shields because you would be going against a death that's doing that, and then it would be doing 535. Absolutely nuts considering this includes infections and weaknesses, so certain damage debuffs just don't work on ice anymore. And as if one weakness cleared wasn't enough, they added yet another one. Now this one is honestly way better because it does way more damage, but this spell clears up to 6 weaknesses, and for each weakness you clear, you put a 25% weakness on your opponent. It's the ultimate Uno reverse card, and because you're clearing the weakness and then doing damage as this card says, this is a very good card even against one weakness if you're trying to finish off your opponent. It is obviously super costly in pips. Would I use this over, another weakness clear? I might not if it's not something that I can also do a lot of damage with, but it is worth noting if someone 3-folds you twice as an ice, you can now basically hit through them if they're damage, weaknesses, infections, whatever, and also put 6 weaknesses on your opponent in the same move. That is quite a bit to do in one round, so honestly, I think this is yet again another crazy game changer for ice. And as if ice wasn't done getting W's, now they have another extremely good shield gambit. Now, if you guys don't know what a shield gambit is, it's basically a spell that gives up your own shields for extra effects. The most common one is Ice Scion. This spell does 700 more damage than the base damage that an an ice can do on an 11 pip spell if you have 4 shields on yourself. So let's say that I put on, like, I don't know, a couple of Ellie shields against, I don't know, a storm. The storm hit through the storm shields. Now I'm left with 2 fire shields and 2 ice shields. In that scenario, I could do 1700 damage by giving up those shields as an ice. Now, while damage is one form of value, it looks like Lord of Winter's giving another form of value that could be way, way better. If you have 4 shields on yourself, what this spell would do is it would do 845 damage, and then it would give you 4 power pips back. So it looks like they're turning pips into value with this. Now, obviously, is it great damage for 10 pips? It's a little bit on the lower side. But what I really, really like about the spell is that you don't have to gambit all 4 shields to get power pips. Let's say you have 2 shields. This is a spell that does 845 damage and gives you 2 power pips back. Right, this could be really, really easy to combo with, especially when you find yourself with any sort of open shot as an ice, which now might be easier when people are avoiding weaknessing you. Now, here's something that nobody expected. Some of the Beast Moon spells also got updated into spell elements this update. And there's a reason why I started with ice. Ice got niced by their Beast Moon spell elements. If you want another reason to do Beast Moon, if you're an ice wizard, you might want to do Beast Moon. So Volcanic Golem, your eyes do not deceive you, is broken in my opinion. This spell, they kind of popped off in maybe a bad way. This spell is now a hit and shield. That is what it is, but the shield is based on the school of your opponent. That's what that symbol means. And based on that ×2 symbol, what I believe this does, it hits, and then it does 245 shields based on the school of your opponent, no matter what. This is not like a conditional. It's just a spell that does what it says it does. Now, the only other hit and shield, as in it just always does a shield regardless of whether your opponent has something on them or not, is Abominable. Now we have yet another hit and shield as an ice. It's spammable, and it's a set shield. And added on to all of that, ice now has yet another utility, which is aura clearing. This is another thing that nobody expected. I'm really happy they added something at Thieving Dragon. Is this going to be something that's good for the game or bad? We won't really know. But what this spell does is, at max tier anyways, it does nearly 400 damage, and then it clears your opponent's aura and gives you a 70% shield based on their school. What I'm going to assume is that it's a 70 shield if it's any school but balance, and if it's balance, I'm going to assume it's a 60 shield, because chromatic stuff normally affects balance the least. They also buffed other spells so that now they're a little bit better. So for example, Evil Snowman, what it used to do was it cleared weaknesses for a weak shield on yourself and a weak trap on your opponent for each weakness cleared. Now they've really simplified it, but honestly, I don't think it's actually that crazy. What this does is it clears 2 weaknesses on yourself first. It does that first. It makes them into set shields based on the school of your opponent. They're 65 shields, pretty good, and then it hits. I want to say that the order changing is intentional because it says clear and then hit. If you're in Live Realm, if you use Snowman, it actually hits and then clears weaknesses for what it does with shields and traps. What this means is now ice is on par, if not better than Myth, at dealing damage when weaknesses are present, because they have a low pip utility, a high pip utility, and even King Art, which is kind of a low damage but extremely high utility spell. And as if all of that was not enough, Colossus also got changed. What this spell used to do was it used to give up shields on yourself for traps on your opponent, but now you're giving up weaknesses on your opponent for traps, not shields on yourself. Now keep in mind, shields on yourself are easier to get, and 55 traps is a buff from what it used to be, which was 35 in Live Realm. I think to me it really depends on how you get those weaknesses on your opponent. Like, I mean, there seems to be this idea that you can maybe put weaknesses on your opponent if you have weaknesses on yourself, but I would say the 25% universal weaknesses are very useful to reduce damage. So really, I think this spell becomes good when you're going against a school that's also good against weaknesses, which would just be Myth and Ice, so that they don't turn those into value. So whilst Colossus does fall under that category of giving up stuff that's useful to you to do something also kind of useful, it does have its place in the meta. I think 55 traps are kind of nuts. I mean, the stats are still unchanged, right? They're really, really good right now. So in a lot of ways, I think we're going to see Ice become a powerhouse in PvP again. It might be a lot better in PvE as well. It has way more utility in the battlefield. Next up are Storm spell changes. They did not play around with Storm either. It's absolutely not. Starting off with Stormlord, a 7 pip hit that does nearly 800 damage. That's obviously the power that we know and love from Storm, but it also can create blades on you based on having heals on yourself. Now, you might have seen the this symbol a lot, but yes, this is based on the school of the caster, meaning anyone can use Stormlord. But yes, 70 blades are kind of nuts, especially when they're based on your school. This is by far the most powerful buff that we have seen up to this point. I think the real challenge of using this spell is getting those heals on yourself, right? I mean, I could easily see myself maybe throwing out a berry surprise. And yes, that's only one heal, but by Stormlording out of this, I immediately get a pretty decent hit into a 70 blade, right? I think that could be really, really cool if you're just trying to string a quick combo together. But since there are a lot of spells now that can create multiple heals on yourself, maybe there's ways to combine other schools or even use storm spells to get those 3 heals, and then you're threatening something nuts. Leviathan looks like it's one of the best damage overtime counters in the game right now. For 8 pips, it does over 800 damage. Now, I would argue 800 damage for an 8 pip spell, kind of weak for Storm, but it can clear up to 3 overtimes on yourself for a weakness each, which could be kind of decapitating if you actually end up with that many overtimes on yourself. You're probably thinking, Sauce, when am I ever gonna have 3 overtimes on myself? That's crazy. But there's a lot of fire spells, a lot of myth spells, and a lot of life spells now that actually do add that many copies. The way they're scaling power now for dots anyways in this game is, if it's a very powerful dot, the damage gets split over many dots instead of a lot of damage being on one dot. We'll see how that concept works out, but obviously if you're gonna have, like, you know, spells that create extreme numbers of damage overtimes on yourself, you also do need spells that can counter them, right? Otherwise the game's not balanced. But you should be able to use the spell to counter protected dots along with unprotected dots, which is kind of a cool concept. For example, right now, if you were to use a good trap counter as a fire, you would use Immolate, right? This is like the best option. And what the spell does is it creates a protected overtime as a base, and it creates an extra overtime after it clears trap. A protected overtime and an unprotected overtime is basically something that you would need to clear 3 times to completely remove. Now we have the ability to do that. We've never had that before. We could not only see other schools trap stack, bait, and immolate from a fire and then use this like with storm damage, but we could also see storms completely decimate overtime strats with this card. I think Sirens is surprisingly one of the better things that Storm got from the Spellman update, because this is actually something that I could see myself using. If y'all don't know, they did nerf Banshee, so it no longer damage weaknesses. This is in the update note. That means that having blades on yourself, it might make infections happen on you more easily, but it won't actually mean that you have a damage debuff on you, which is the worst thing for a Storm. So you might see more blade strats, and what this does is it hits, and then it makes your blades, any blade that you have on yourself, into extremely powerful 65% blade. Now, obviously, how good the blades on you to begin with are, like, I think it kind of determines whether this is worth using or not, but I could see myself maybe, you know, ending up with blades from a lot of these new spells and then gambiting them for even more powerful blades while doing damage. Easily the best spell for Storm out of all of the Spellman updates that we've seen up to this point is Storm Owl. I would argue that the top hat, definitely usable. I mean, that's a ton of damage for 10 pips. I feel like that's what I might even gravitate toward. But the Spellmented version, which we saw in the teaser, is pretty damn good. Now, they've updated this. I think this is a little bit different than the teaser that I covered a few days ago, but basically, you can get 1400 damage up front and then 3 pips per heal on yourself. This spell can unironically give you 12 pips back. I don't know how often you'll get 4 heals on yourself, but yes, that's an extremely powerful mechanic considering the damage that it already does base. Easily the best spell out of all the R2 Spellmans for Storm. In King Art, I'm gonna be honest, I think the damage is aight, but like in the top path, but honestly nothing that crazy, nothing that different than what we're used to. And the Spellman path is also pretty garbage in my opinion. I mean, it clears 3 heals on your opponent and makes heals on yourself, but the damage is actually pretty low. I'd say that if you're going for a heal clear, I still think Triton is way better because you can get very good blades out of it, and you're still clearing 2 for 6 pips. That's not bad at all. We'll have to see when 3 heal clears actually is more meta than 2. Maybe I'm like very mistaken and like you might need 3 in the future, but that's going to be the big determining factor as to whether you use this or not as a Storm. Now, I feel like this spell might low-key be slept on if I don't include this in the video. They also did update Thermic Golem. It's now a hit and weakness for 4 pips for Storm. This is a part of Storm's new weakness identity. It's like one of the few ways they can defend themselves because they don't really have resist or health. They just have healing and weaknesses. I don't know how I feel about this. On one hand, Catalan does 700 damage with a 35 weakness, essentially for 1 more pip, but how often are you actually going to use this and not end up using 6 pips? So if you're gonna be using 6 pips anyways, I feel like almost with 6 pips, stringing 2 of these together is just gonna be way better than ever using one of them. So if you're running maybe a high pip conserve strat where you can turn that extra pip into a new pip for yourself, then I think Catalan's really, really better. But if not, then I actually think this might be the best hidden weakness that Storm has right now, which might be a major buff for Storm. Now, the one other change is a Storm nerf, unfortunately, but they basically switched Kraken and Stormzilla. So I don't know if y'all remember, but Kraken used to be a 4-pip damage overtime removal, and now it's a weakness gambit like Stormzilla used to be. This spell turns 2 weaknesses, not 3 like Stormzilla used to be. I'm assuming that's because it's a 4-pip spell now instead of a 5-pip. And for those weaknesses, it can make heals on yourself and then do 400 damage. Now, this is interesting to me because if you can get 2 weaknesses on yourself, you have a very, very easy way of setting up a Jhin, right? 4 pips into a 7-pip for what, 1700 damage? That's actually not that crazy. This is a spell that does double damage if you have 2 heals on yourself. Now, with all these new weakness spells though, how easy is it going to be to get, like, you know, that many weaknesses? It's not going to be easy, but 2 seems pretty easy to do for me. So maybe this is actually something that helps. The nerf part of this is obviously if you have a dot on yourself, now to get to anything that requires 2 clears to get rid of, it's going to be way, way harder to do it because now you need 5 pip. And the same issue between Thermid Golem and Catalan arises with Stormzilla versus Kraken. It's a lot harder to combo a 5-pip spell than a 4-pip spell, so this will have some effects, especially if other schools are using what we're using anyways, Kraken as dot removal. Now, because there's so much to go through, I will be covering the balance, life, myth, and death spells in tomorrow's video, but I did want to show off the fire spells, so we get through a good few of them. Now, fire actually got some pretty cool changes to their Nova spell, which I actually think might be good for myth and fire. The spell used to be a 2 shield clear. It's become a 4 shield clear. And it used to be a protected damage over time. Now it splits the 930 damage it does over 2 over time. Now, if they move away from protected damage over times, and move into copies, then you could see things that, you know, maybe even clear once being way better to use than before. Right, if I use like a lightning bats, which is only a 1 dot clear spell, I could get rid of half of this damage right away. I wouldn't have been able to do that before. So in that way, I guess you could argue that dots are a little bit weaker. I would just argue that it just adds more dimension to them than just being a basic something that you can just spam. As far as a shield clear for the 45 myth traps, I don't know how I feel about this. This seems really, really broken. Now, let's say someone had 4 shields on them and you were to use a glimpse on a fire. Your best combo out of it, because you can't really use myth traps that easily, is probably to Jhin. And while I do like that you can basically have access to 1550 damage, this isn't as strong as it used to be. So what concerns me is that myth is going to be using this spell way, way better. And I don't know, I just feel like getting that powerful of traps while being able to run fire damage and having overtime pressure could be a lot on a myth. You might just want to avoid shielding on a myth altogether. Not that, you know, that's anything new, but it just became even worse with this spell, in my opinion. Like, if they got 5 pips, this is a really, really good spell. The good news is myth can't run fire accuracy and storm accuracy, and you kind of need storm damage to counter dots and heals. So maybe people will elect to be weaker against heals and, you know, like dots if they want more shield pressure as myths, but maybe that balancing act will like catch up with them. Glacial Golem is also really, really weird. It's like a very, very small hit and heal, but it's honestly pretty damn good compared to other hit and heals we've had as a fire. Like, compared to Power Link, which does about 400 damage and does about 300 healing, this does a little bit less damage and it does a little bit more healing, but you don't have the liability of someone removing the OT or someone removing the heal or any of that stuff. So I do think this is pretty decent. I think fire is such an offensive school though that this is only good if you need some sort of maybe weakness breaker in the middle of an interaction where you're actually threatening a stronger hit. Now, here's where it gets juicy. They gave fire a lot of anti-trap and anti-shield stuff with their rank 7 to 10 spellman. Fire finally has an extremely good trap counter. Now, I'm gonna be honest, bro. I honestly think that Immolate, as we mentioned earlier, is pretty decent. But the fact that you have to do damage to yourself to get rid of traps was not doing it for me as a fire. Now, we have something that's actually really, really good, right? So now, you have a 7-pip spell that for its base does 2 5-round overtimes that add up to 1030 damage, right? No matter what you have on yourself, that's what the spell does. Pretty decent for 7-pip. But then, you could also clear traps on yourself to add an overtime on your opponent. But the added effect is what makes the spell so lit. You can clear up to 5 traps on yourself to make another damage overtime. Now, the one thing I'm a little bit unclear about is it 1 overtime that's 400 damage and 3 rounds per trap? Or is it just a 3rd overtime added on to the 2 that we already have? And it gets more and more powerful based on the amount of traps that you clear. If it works like Immolate, then this, I want to say that the more traps it cleared, the 2nd overtime it created was more and more powerful. And I do think it would be kind of ludicrous for a spell to create 7 overtimes on the opponent if we're, you know, correct in assuming that it's 1 dot per trap cleared. So I don't really know about this. If it's 3 overtimes, I love this spell. I'm gonna be packing this spell. I'm gonna be on 7 pips anytime I even suspect someone's about to trap my ass. Ifrit. Now this I wanted to include in this video because I think it's controversial. The hit and weakness officially is no PvP. Now they have yet to make the TC no PvP, which I assume is coming. But now there is no hit and defense spell for fire anymore. If they also axe the top paths for PvP and just keep the healing, which would make sense because fire is not a shielding squad, then you're going to be fully reliant on either pressuring with dots and traps or healing as your form of defense as a fire. Now what does Ifrit actually do? I think it's honestly pretty dope. It basically, if you have dots on your opponent, you can basically just turn them into even more damage. The base spell does do 820 damage, which I would argue is really, really good. But I think the actual effect is where the extra damage really is. You can basically add 460 damage, that's 6 rounds on a dot. And you can do 3 of those per overtime that you have on your opponent. So for example, right, let's say like somebody shields and then you elf. What this spell does is it hits and then it clears a shield for a dot, creating 2 dots. You can immediately punish a single shield, which everybody does, you know, with an elf, into this, and you could basically be threatening 820 damage plus 2 dots that add up to over 900 damage for 8 pips. That is 1700 damage for 8 pips just for punishing 1 single shield as a fire. It could be absolutely nuts. I'm really happy that there is now a spell that actually like plays around more with dots. We were really missing that as a fire. I think this is going to be something, even in PvE, you can do a ton of damage with. Rain of Fire, this was already teased, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But yes, you could basically, you know, create an absolute ton of dots. This is apparently a 6 dot spell if you know, do it to the full value of it. It leverages healing, may be usable, I don't know. Honestly, it's a lot, man. What I think is super interesting is King Art. It is much like Elephant, a hit that goes through shields to do damage. I think that mechanic in general is really OP because, you know, like shields are so used for defense. And honestly, 800 damage through shields up to 7 is nuts, right? There's no real way now, if someone has 8 pips as a fire, to shield against them on 1 round. You would have to somehow cover a tower shield twice with like an LE shield and a spirit shield, and even then you're not safe. So the actual mechanic where it clears shields and then hits, really good. What I'm again curious about is how does this shield clearing into heal work? Do you get a bigger and bigger heal for the more shields that you clear? Like, is this 1 shield is a 200 heal overtime for 5 rounds? 2 shields is a 400. I can't imagine it's that good, but the card doesn't really explain. All I'm gonna say is, even if it's like, you know, a 200 hot no matter what, no matter how many shields you clear, it's probably worth using because it's a hit that goes through a shield. You just gain on your opponent immediately. Really powerful. Compared to Elephant for 1 more pip, really nuts. If you're not feeling it, you also have a really easy hit and stun that you can just, you know, power up. 875 damage, that's not a small amount either. And finally, the GOAT, Sun Serpent. Y'all, I don't know how I feel about this spell. Cause see, I really like Sun Serpent the way that it is. It's just a big hitter, but it's looking like that path is about to become no PvP. Now, the TC is still allowed. I'm gonna assume it's going to be banned, which is kind of a big hit for fire, in my opinion. But what we get in return is yet another trap counter, and this one clears up to 6 traps. Now, what I do like about it is, if someone is brain dead trapping you, you can essentially gain all the pips that you use on the spell back immediately, because it gives you 2 pips per trap that you clear. And how does this work? It's 3 6-round overtimes that add up to a maximum of 1635 damage. So that's what this says. So because it's 3, you would need something even more powerful at removing dots and the now new Stormzilla to completely counter it. And if your opponent is trapping you, then you're getting pips back to literally spam this. I think once a fire's at 10 pips, you can no longer spam traps at them. I think it's officially game over for people that go into queue only wanting to trap, because I don't really see if you're just trap spamming, how you could ever keep up with something like this. Now, me personally, I like that. I don't think you should just go into queue and just trap spam like a weirdo. I feel like spells like this are a big deterrent against it. Like, you can say that fire gets a lot of value out of this. I'm not even gonna lie to you. I think any school can use this and absolutely curb stomp trapping, because how do you keep up with it? You have to get rid of the OT, right? You have to also replace the traps, and you have to keep up with the extra pips that this gives you. That's 3 different things that are all equally powerful, especially on a fire. All in all, y'all, the meta is super changing. Some of these spells I really plan on adding to my deck. Some of them I don't really know, but I'm excited altogether because I think these spells are going to change the game. They're very easy to get compared to the previous Spellman update, and there's tons more to talk about. So turn on noties. I hope you guys enjoyed my full coverage of the fire, ice, and storm spells, but there's 4 other schools, so turn on noties and I'll cover them in tomorrow's video. As always, let me know what you guys think of these spells. Drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub review, and if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome. See y'all soon, and yeah.